In the first set of slides in this series, we introduced you to our organization, explained that our nation's schools are not as successful as schools in other wealthy nations, that indoor air quality was the major cause of loss of learning, and I introduced you to the fact that COVID-19 stimulus funding money could go a long way towards solving this problem. In this brief presentation, we will help you understand more about how powerful an impact poor indoor air quality has on students, that it can cost them 1 or 2 letter grades in learning each and every cumulative year. We will explain how the legal standards for what is called, quote, healthy environment, end quote, were developed, and how these standards are obsolete and do not recognize how a child's brain works in oxygen-deprived environment. The slide you see before you has a title, Outside Air Pollution, that lowers student performance. This is quite a reputable study. It was published in Health Affairs, which is a peer-reviewed medical journal, and it involved, as you see at the top there, 3,660 schools containing 1,629,000 students. It's the entire state of Michigan. And what they did was measure air pollution outside schools and how it impacted the student performance inside the school. And because they had 1,600,000 students, they were able to control for socioeconomic status. They could take areas that had a lot of pollution and compare them rich students to poor students. They could take areas that had very low pollution and compare academic performance, rich students to poor students. And the slide you see before you has some very interesting lessons in it. The first is, if you look at the bottom scale and go from left to right, as you approach fifth, 5 is the worst air pollution for the schools. And you can see that the failure rate is almost double the failure rate in the low pollution schools. But the second thing you can see is the bottom line, which is gold or yellow, is 3rd grade. The one above that is 4th grade. And then there's a big gap in between 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. And the failure rate increases more the older the student gets. And I'm going to come back to that, but I want you to understand this is a fundamental piece of data I hope you grasp. So I'm going to move now to inside air pollution because inside air pollution is often 2 to 5 times worse and occasionally more than 100 times worse than what we saw in outside levels. And 1/2 of our nation's 115,000 K through 12 schools have got indoor air quality problems, according to EPA. So how was the regulation about indoor air quality developed? In the 1950s, they gathered together very large groups of people and they asked them to hold up their hand if they could not smell body odor. And if 80 people out of 100 couldn't smell body odor, the air was declared, quote, healthy. And it turns out that smelling body odor is associated with carbon dioxide. So the higher the perception of body odor is, the higher the carbon dioxide is in the air. And at that point, in order to make the majority of people happy, the legal limit for building new buildings in the United States was set at 20,000 parts per million. In the 70s, things changed because there were many less farmers and physical labor was not quite as demanding and social tolerance for body odor changed. So the legal limit was changed for new construction to 10,000 parts per million. In the 2000s, the legal limit was further reduced to 5,000. And this is the basis of the definition of healthy air in the United States. I'm going to show you that healthy air, legally defined, is very different than the air which allows your brain to function well. This is a study done of 30 commercial airline pilots, each of whom took 3 flight segments of 3 hours each, for a total of 270 hours of testing. And the carbon dioxide levels in the trainer that they worked in, basically, when you train an airplane pilot, you don't give him the keys like you do a 16-year-old and sit in the seat next to him and hope he doesn't hit anything. An airplane, you sit in a pretend airplane on the ground, and it's set up so that it can send an alarm that you're out of fuel or that there's a rocket approaching you from the right or something like that. It's a computer simulated trainer. And in this particular case, they changed the carbon dioxide level and they put pilots through very routine flying exercises. And what they found was in areas where the pilots behaved in 2 different ways, and in areas where the carbon dioxide was 700 parts per million, they had twice the success rate as when they tried to do the same thing at 2,500 parts per million. And I want to remind you that the ASHRAE standard and the building code for new buildings is 5,000 parts per million CO2. What you see in this slide is the results of standardized testing to large groups of students who were in classrooms or testing centers where the carbon dioxide could be measured. And the researchers changed the level of carbon dioxide and administered the tests over and over again. It was the same level of rigor for all the tests. The tests were the same amount of hardness. And they wanted to find out how carbon dioxide affected their performance. And what you can see here is when carbon dioxide was at 600 parts per million, the students tested in the 95th percentile. Now I want to remind you, the building code calls for 5,000 in new schools. When the researchers changed the amount of carbon dioxide and raised it in the testing center, student failure rate changed down to the 80th percentile. And when they changed it again, down to 2,000 parts per million, which is the highest our meters will record, the students performed at the 40th percentile. The only thing that changed was the amount of oxygen or carbon dioxide in the air. And 1/2 of our nation's schools have indoor air qualities that lower learning. In this slide, I want to remind you that COVID stimulus money can help us fix this project. We have a huge opportunity to improve the standards of our school systems as well as protect us from COVID infection. We just have to have the national will. In the next slide I'm going to show you how we tested hundreds of classrooms, how we documented our findings, and what we found. I hope you tune in for that.